right, so let's go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to the webinar about safeguarding your Jira setup, leveraging DevOps and Salto for Jira. Just a couple of housekeeping items for those of you who've been in the room for a little bit. I've already gone over this, but we've got a webinar chat, so feel free to click on that, share any questions, thoughts, feedback you might have during the presentation. And then specifically, if you do have a question you'd like to ask, please go ahead and ask in the Q&A. And in the Q&A, there'll be specific questions, or sorry, you can ask a specific question and we'll make sure that that gets answered throughout the webinar. And then also just for kind of timekeeping, we expect this webinar to last anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, really depends on the questions that you might have. We have the full 60 minutes set up here, so if you do have questions, keep them coming. We'd love to get those questions answered. But yeah, expect about 30, 45 minutes for the content. And let's get started. So my name is Scott Dixon. I'm a customer engineer at Salto. I help our customers onboard and implement with Salto, as well as evaluate during the pre-sales process, making sure it's going to be a good technical fit. And also with me, I've got Jimmy. So Jimmy, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you. I go by both James or Jimmy. Most people in the community know me as Jimmy. I have been an Atlassian admin at multiple different companies for a little over 10 years now. I'm a community leader, so you'll regularly see me in the online community helping to answer questions for people. I do have a number of Atlassian certifications, and I am currently at an Atlassian customer by the name of Arctic Wolf, and we are also a Salto customer.
Great, thank you, Jimmy. All right, so just to want to give a little bit of background, and then we'll just jump right into it. So a little bit of background about Salto and kind of how it fits into the overall ecosystem. So as many of you all know, SaaS applications now run the modern company. So we've got a lot of different logos here representing all the different SaaS applications that your organization might use. Not only Jira, but Salesforce, NetSuite for your finance tools, customer support tools like Zendesk, identity management tools like Okta, and the list goes on and on. And all of these apps require a deep level of customization to make sure they're going to be a great fit for you. So in terms of Jira, making sure that we've got projects that've got the right workflows assigned to them, they've got the right automations, got the right issue types, field types, and so on. So all of this requires a deep level of customization. And to customize, there's a lot of no or low code tools, including within the admin panel itself, within a lot of these business applications. But it comes with some challenges of their own, and which is why we have developed Salto. So Salto brings DevOps principles from software development to IT and business applications. So we're able to adapt some of the best practices and tools from DevOps into how business and IT applications are managed. So just to give you a little background about Salto. All right, so I want to get started with a poll. So I'm going to launch this poll in just a second. All right, so you should see a poll open called Configuration Management for Jira, and it's got a number of questions about kind of how you're using Jira today. So I'll give you all a couple minutes to take a look at that before we go right into the demo. But in the meantime, Jimmy, wanted to ask you a quick question. So the webinar, obviously all about safeguarding your Jira setup. Wanted to ask you, kind of from all your experience in the Atlassian space, do you have a couple, or do you have a story that kind of comes in mind in terms of, kind of the downsides if you're not safeguarding your setup? People accidentally removing something in production, something getting misconfigured, and trying to track down where that happened.
Yeah, I mean, I see a few of those happen on a regular basis, more often than I would like. But we react to them as fast as we can. I think one that definitely comes to mind is having a status renamed. I have worked with multiple other administrators, and when that happens, it's one of those things that when that happens, that can cause your users to notice the problems before you do. So by not having safeguards in place, the ability to roll back to a, a known good state is sometimes a little bit more challenging.
Right. So we've got a couple of answers here. I'm going to leave that poll open for a little bit, so I will continue to keep that poll open. So feel free to keep on answering those. And let's jump right into the demo with Salto. So I want to jump through how Salto can really help you kind of safeguard that setup. So to do that, I want to give you a quick overview of Salto and some of the features that can really help you with making sure that any changes that you make are going to be intentional, giving you also the ability to roll back any unintentional changes. So a quick little high level view of Salto. Salto is a platform to manage business applications. And the first thing that you're going to do here in Salto is to connect to your environments. Now, in my case, I'm using a sandbox environment and a production environment. And actually, speaking of, from the first poll results here, very first question was, do you use a Jira sandbox? So all of you have answered, and it looks like about 43% of you are using a sandbox. And not only are you using it, but you're also using it before making almost any change to production. And another 29% of you are using it, but only before making major changes to production. And about 29% of you aren't using a sandbox at all. Jimmy, I wanted to ask, in terms of using a sandbox in Jira, just from your perspective, what are some of the advantages of using a sandbox? Have you ever, like how have you used it in not only your current role, but in any past teams you've worked in?
So I think the one thing you definitely get the advantage of is it's completely isolated from your production environment. So by doing changes in a sandbox, you know that you're not going to affect something either intentionally or unintentionally in your production environment. So it's one of those things where that's sort of the safe side to it. I think the one disadvantage though is the fact that you have to either recreate the changes or it's one of those things where you balance off. And I think the people who sort of answered that they use it only for major changes, what things do we want to do in the sandbox because we don't want to affect production, but these smaller things where we can hide them behind schemes and things like that where they won't be visible immediately. We're going to do those in production so we don't have to do a lot of duplicated effort.
Mm-hmm. So jumping right back into Salto here. So the way, again, Salto works by connecting up to your environment. So if you are using a sandbox environment, you can connect to that as well as your production environment. You run a fetch here with Salto, and later on, I'll talk a little bit about this, but basically running a fetch creates almost like a backup of that environment in terms of the configurations, so that if anything does go wrong, you're able to restore back to that previous state that it was during that snapshot. So after you run that first fetch, you're going to be able to see everything that makes up that environment. So also wanted to note that with Jira, we support both software projects and JSM projects. So if you've got only one type of project in an environment, Salto could fetch all of that, as well as if you have both types of projects in a single environment, Salto could fetch those as well. Under the Explore tab, you're going to see the entire environment listed out in this folder-like structure. And for example, you can see all of your issue types. You can see all of the issue type schemes. I can even come down, see all of my projects. Now, you can see here that they're going to be divided into my software projects and my service desk projects. I can dig into any of my software projects. I can see all of the issue type schemes that are all the different schemes that are tied to it. So a really helpful way just to get an idea of what's being used today. Now, let's say that you were to make a change to maybe an issue type scheme. So let me actually just click onto one of these issue type schemes. Now, if I come into Salto, I can immediately see that this particular issue type scheme is only being leveraged by this one particular project. So any changes that I make to this scheme would obviously take place for this project. So this is a great place to come ahead of making those changes, because you can immediately see where some of those changes take place. So you can imagine like Jimmy, you were mentioning about the changing of the status. That's something that you could also do in Salto. Go down to the status, see if any, like for example, I've got this test status down here. I can see if it's being used anywhere. In this case, it's not. So this is probably a safe one to either rename, remove, or do something with. Whereas something like my to-do, I can see it's being used across many different workflows and some request types. All right, so going back to the being able to fetch into Salto and kind of create that snapshot of that environment. So I want to show you kind of a real example about how you could use that in your day-to-day. So I've got a number of automations in my production environment. Now, obviously, I've got automations, I've got workflows. A lot of these are really key components that I want to make sure that if anything is being changed directly in production, I want to get alerted on that. So I've got the ability in Salto to come over to my monitor changes section, and I can create a number of notifications to be sent out in case anything changes. So in the case of, I've got 3 different notifications, one on if any workflows are modified, one if any permission schemes are updated, and then one about if any automations or workflows are removed. Jimmy, I wanted to ask, we chatted about this earlier, kind of talking about, what happens if something goes wrong. If you don't have a notification like this where it can give you an alert when, a specific change is made, what are some other ways that you end up finding out that something has been misconfigured or something isn't working?
I mean, I know we talked briefly about the fact that your users will definitely let you know the moment something is not working properly, and I know that's probably not the most ideal way to find it, but I have definitely seen some of the other things. I have gone through the audit log at times to try and find some things based on it depends on what the change is as to who made the change as far as trying to track things down. We have a number of things that email out to, or sorry, notify out to Slack as well. And I'm pretty sure these ones can also go to Slack. So it's one of those things where we live and breathe in Slack. So that's kind of where we end up having a lot of things sent to so that we're aware of things.
Thanks, Jimmy. Yeah, so like Jimmy mentioned, there are ways to get alerted if things go wrong, but sometimes that's your users telling you directly, like, hey, we're not able to create this issue, or we can, but now it's not going through the flow as expected. So before those types of before you get alerted that way, you got to wait in Salto to kind of get ahead of the curve. So I want to focus on this specific alert. So I've got this alert set out that if a workflow or an automation is removed directly in my production environment, and if it's happening through Jira directly. So in other words, not if it's happening through Salto, but it's happening in Jira, send me an alert. And actually, I got one right now where I saw that a number, if you can see here, a number of automations were removed. And in this PDF, it also contains the exact kind of makeup of those automations at the time when they were removed. This can be also sent to Slack. This can be sent to multiple email addresses. So you can imagine getting this notification, and maybe maybe a couple of these you meant to remove, but a couple of these were unintentional. I need to get these back ASAP. So what I can do here in Salto is actually come back to our change log. And the change log is going to basically capture those snapshots. So every single time that you're running those fetches, which also we ran on a schedule, by the way, daily, hourly, or weekly. And if you see when I highlight over these, it will show that I can restore back to that environment. So let me go ahead and choose this because I know that these were there the day before. So I can go ahead and click on restore. And now Salto is going to prepare a deployment that will essentially show me everything that I need to do in the environment to restore it back to that state that it was at that time. Now, in this case, I've actually just got these 6 automations. So in this case, the only changes that it detected were these 6 automations that were removed, which are the exact same ones as the ones that I got alerted on. But let's say that a couple of these were intentional. I only need to, get back maybe a couple of these. So with Salto, you can select which of those changes you want to restore back to. Now, in this case, I'm showing, all automation changes, but you can imagine if you've made a number of changes over the past 1 to 2 days, this could be a much larger list of changes. And again, Salto will allow you to select only those changes and you can move forward in the deployment process. So this next process is going to make sure that anything that you're doing to restore doesn't have any additional dependencies. So let's say, for example, these automations also had statuses or fields or something else that they were relying on, and those were also removed. If those were removed, Salto will also flag them during the deployment process saying, hey, you're trying to re-add this automation, but the automation is referring now to fields or statuses that were deleted. We need to include them as part of the deployment. Now, in this case, that didn't happen because it looks like whoever removed these just removed those automations. So at this stage, I am good to go. I can go ahead and click on deploy. And after this deployment is done, Salto will have restored those 3 automations right back to their original spot. And I can keep on moving. So you can imagine this much faster than having to go to the audit log, track down what exactly was changed, kind of remember how those automations had been set up, and manually create them in the UI. And the reason I wanted to show this first is, going back to the poll, there was the very last question was, have you or a colleague ever deleted a configuration in production? So for the 40% of you that said yes, this workflow could come in handy to be able to have these snapshots to go back to restore. And any of the configurations that Salto is fetching, so the projects, the request types, all the schemes, workflows, automations, fields, anything from the JSM project or a software project in terms of the configurations, Salto can help restore those back. And again, if you do have any questions, feel free to drop those into the Q&A and we will take a look during the presentation. Now, this is a great way to restore, if something goes wrong, but how can you kind of prevent things from going wrong in the first place? So that's where I kind of want to take a step back and show you how you can even further safeguard your Jira setup by creating a solid change management process where you are making those changes in the sandbox environment, using a tool like Salto to then promote them up into a production environment, associating them with a change request, and clearly documenting your changes. So let's say that I've got some changes. Maybe I have a new workflow that I've created and I've tested my sandbox environment. And I want to go ahead and take that same workflow and essentially mirror it, creating it in my production environment. So with Salto, what I could come in here is I could run a compare and deploy. I would look at the source environment, in other words, where I built that configuration. And I would compare that against the production environment or where I pushed that, or where I want to push that configuration to. And I'm going to call this add new workflow. And to actually add a little bit, I've got a change request that I'm representing. I've got a board that I use to track change requests to Jira. And I'm going to associate it with this ticket ID and create the comparison. And actually, speaking of kind of documenting your changes made to production, during the poll, we'd asked, how are individuals documenting their changes to production? Actually, 60% of you said that you are using Jira tickets or another ticket management platform. So this would be a great workflow for you to be able to associate directly with a change request. And then for the 20% of you that said that you don't, or you're relying on the audit logs, this might be a good way to start to implement that sort of documentation process. Actually, Jimmy, curious from what you've seen in the field, how are some ways that users have, you as an admin, how have you documented changes and how has that been successful and where has that kind of failed because something wasn't documented?
So a lot of our stuff is in Confluence,
Mm-hmm.
just because that's sort of corporate standard for a lot of our documentation. The thing that we have to be careful about is that we'll get like new project requirements there. We'll build it out as far as what needs to be included fields, workflow steps, a whole bunch of things like automations, and just it gets documented there, so that if anyone at any point in time wanted to see what a project is supposed to look like, they can come and look at the Confluence page. All the changes themselves are documented in Jira, and we have tickets for all the changes that get made. Um, but if we forget or we don't keep the Confluence documentation up to date, then what's live might not necessarily match what has been documented.
Mhm. And has that ever caused any issues where the documentation wasn't necessarily up to date with the real state?
It has caused a little bit of confusion at times. Usually, what it ends up being is it's a sweeping change of we want to add this new field to 6 different issue types,
Mhm.
and we get 5 of the pages, but forget one of them, and then people are like, "Wait,
Mhm.
we wanted this field on everything." It's just a well, yeah, it is there. We just yeah. So
Now, going back to the deployment, so now I've got this comparison opened up between my sandbox and production environment. So I'm going to go ahead and find my workflow that I've added in my sandbox environment, which is going to be down here under workflow configuration. And this is the specific workflow that I want to add. So I can just go ahead and select it. And as soon as I select it, Salto is going to flag that there's a missing dependency. So this workflow is actually referring to a status, and that status doesn't yet exist in my production environment. So I need to also add the status. Now, actually kind of going back to your point, Jimmy, about potentially making a change, but not doing the full scope of the change. Something that Salto can help out with is under the other dependencies, it's going to flag all of the places where configurations that you've selected are being referenced. So what I mean by that is if I look at that on hold status that I've added, that status is also being used by this filter, it's also being referenced by this screen, but that update to include that reference hasn't been included to production yet. So if you did want to kind of group together all of these changes in one go and push them in one go, you could go through review and add these as well. So that could kind of help with not accidentally not missing one of those issue types. And actually, before I move forward with this deployment, Jimmy, quick question, because I'm using a sandbox environment. We talked a lot about a sandbox environment, but if you're not using a sandbox environment, what alternatives might you have to make changes in a safer manner in a single Jira environment?
yeah, I know that like I work for a fairly larger company now, and the ability to afford having all the things is a nice luxury. But I worked at a startup before, and the idea of paying for another Jira instance or paying for premium to get a sandbox was not there. So we ended up using a test project. So it was a project that no one did any active development on, but we could push changes into a schema there ahead of going to the live projects. Now, granted, there are certain things such as like if you were to change a status or change the name of a custom field, you can't really sort of block those from being seen live. So there are limits to what you can do, but you can definitely add a new issue type and a new workflow and make sure that the workflow is working the way you want it to in that sort of a test project before applying that scheme to your live project, and you can get some of the benefits of what you need without having to invest in a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Jimmy. So for the about 38% of you that said that you're not using a Jira sandbox, I'm going to point out a few features along the way. So for example, the restore from backup, that's something that you could leverage in Salto today just by connecting to your production environment. And then after I finish with this deployment, I'll share a little bit more about some of the features in Salto that you can leverage even without using the sandbox. Now, now that I've selected my elements, now I could make many more changes than this, but really what I want to do is go ahead and add just that workflow and that status. So I'm going to move on to the next stage. So the next stage in the deployment process is going to be running a check just to make sure that the changes I've selected, there's nothing additional, no additional dependencies that might be needed. And while this is running, I'm going to take a look at one of the questions. So question from Brian. I have a JSM project for a customer care org. Is there a way to copy and clone the entire project to be used as a sandbox? Great, really good question, Brian. So with Salto, you can copy the project in terms of the configurations. However, not the actual like issues or user data. We've got a full list. Actually, let me go ahead and put this in the chat of the types that we are supporting in Salto. And I'm going to put that in the Zoom chat here. So if you'd like to take a look at that. So from the configuration standpoint, yes, we could definitely help you with copying that project, but none of the issues or user data or comments or anything like that. All right, so now with this deployment, it is ready to go, and I can go ahead and click on deploy. So after, because I'm deploying into production, I've labeled that as a sensitive environment within Salto. So it's asking me just to confirm that these are the changes that I want to make. And after this deployment is done, I'm going to get a summary of everything that was done. If I do run into any errors, Salto is going to outline what those errors were and then give me a chance to fix them in a future deployment. And okay, it looks like the deployment was successful. And now we're syncing the environment. So with this, because this deployment is successful, I can go to compare and deploy and look at the history. And now under the history, I'll have a clear history of all the changes that have been made to this environment. By the way, you'll notice that not only was that deployment that I just made documented, but also restoring that restorative action that I just did earlier, where I added, I believe it was 3. Yeah, I added 3 of those deleted automations back. That also gets in your deployment history. So you'll get really a full history of all the changes that you're making through Salto in the deployment history page here, as well as because I've attached this ticket to it. If I come back to the ticket here in Jira and I go to the commits, I can actually see directly, and I'll describe a little bit more of what we're looking at in just a second, but I've got really granular information about exactly what was changed as part of the deployment. Now, kind of discussing about what's being shown here, because at the end of the day, Salto is turning all of the configurations into a flat file structure. We're able to create versions of those configurations over time, and we're using Git to leverage that. So Git, if you're familiar with it, it's a version control software typically used for software development. But again, because Salto is turning all of the configurations into a flat file structure, Salto is able to create versions of these configurations over time, and then we can associate specific changes with it. Now, if I come back to Salto here, and if I come back to the change log, this change log is going to track all of the changes that are happening. So not only the changes that are coming directly from a Salto deployment, but also changes that are being made manually directly in the production environment. So here I can see basically every single time that I fetch, and then Salto is creating that snapshot. Salto is also documenting the changes that we see coming from that snapshot. So I can also click into a specific snapshot. I can also click to see what are the differences of a specific configuration that was updated, deleted, added, modified. So really great for getting really granular levels of information anytime specific changes are made. Now, this is also something that you could leverage, even if you're not using Sandbox, connect it up to your production environment. Salto is going to clearly kind of line out all the changes that are being made. Jimmy, from your experience, because we talked about the audit trail earlier, or the audit log. Going into the audit log, how, what does your flow look like when you need to figure out a change, and what are some of the difficulties when doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't use the audit log as much anymore, because we do have a much better, easier way to see it through Salto. But it was one of those things where when something went wrong, the status change is a great example of that. I didn't make that change, and I know that my partner in crime didn't make that change, but we needed to know who made the change, because I want to use that not as a way to go and, slap them on the wrist, but, learning opportunity, right? Did they
Mhm.
know that making that change was going to have these repercussions? And, we found out that it's one of the guys who was in IT who, didn't know that he didn't know that that status was dependent on anything else. And that was a learning opportunity to show him some of the tools that Jira has to show you at a high level some of the things that are there. Salto does a much better job of showing that sort of dependency structure, but then also to sort of explain. So this is what happens when you make that change, and these are the ramifications. So not that we don't want to change names, but we want to make sure that everyone who's going to be affected by it is aware of it ahead of time, so that when that does happen, we can intentionally be prepared to make any additional changes that would be required to support that. So going into the audit log was more of a means to find who made the change so that we can have a conversation and um, teach someone a little bit more about how to do things in a better way.
Yeah, I like that. Not punishing anyone, but using it as a lesson on how everyone could be more efficient.
Yeah.
Great. And then going back to the settings here, just to kind of loop it all back together. Monitoring for changes is also a really key part of this process, getting visibility into those changes that are being made directly into production. Now, I used it as kind of an example about when you'd want to restore something that was misconfigured or deleted, but kind of like Jimmy was mentioning, it can also get you really good visibility into maybe users that are still continuing to make changes in production, not realizing the impact of those changes, and monitoring for those changes using something like Salto can really help you get visibility into those changes. All right, so I'm just checking to see if there's any questions. If there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Again, we'll make sure that those are answered. And so that covers the core of our topics today. So just 1 second, I'm going to share one last poll. Oh, sorry, I see you got a question. Any quick tips for using workspaces versus working in environments directly? So, Aaron, just a quick follow-up. Do you mean the workspaces like different workspaces within Jira versus workspaces in like another tool? Or I guess like within an environment? Just to make sure I understand the question. Salto's workspace feature. Oh, okay. I see what you mean. That's a great question. So Aaron's asking about a feature that we have in Salto where you can kind of edit the configurations directly. So as I mentioned, we've got Salto is essentially turning all of the configurations into a flat file structure. And now for most of our users, they're making a change in the sandbox environment, pushing them up to a production environment. But Salto does have a number of features that you can leverage by accessing the files directly. But what I mean by that is what Aaron was referring to was a feature of ours called Workspaces. And we can actually do that today through a newer feature called Edit in Environment. This is where you can go directly into an environment and make changes directly. So just to give you an idea what that looks like, I'm going to create a edit type of deployment of my production environment. So what this is doing is getting access into those underlying NOCL files. Now, the most common use cases for this is if you want to make a bulk change across multiple statuses, multiple fields, multiple projects, and it's just much easier to do like something like a find and replace versus having to go in manually and change something in the UI. So the way that you can do this with Salto is going into here and clicking on Open in Web Editor. And this will essentially create this will give you access to the underlying file. So it's a very different view than what we've seen in Salto before. But now I can go in and actually make any edits directly to this file. And I can commit those and then pull them into the deployment. So a way that I've helped some of my customers have used this before is they might have like a a status that, or sorry, they've had a scheme that they've applied to one project, and they want to take that change and propagate it across all of the other schemes in their environment. So what they do is I work with them to identify what type of change that was. They copy and paste it, and then they apply it to that file that represents that project across all the other environments. So it's a bit more of an advanced feature within Salto. Once you really understand kind of the file structure and how it works great for that. Another really common use case is just simply using something like find and replace. So being able to find, maybe you've gone through a rebrand, new company name, new company department, new subdomain, something like that, and you need to replace every single instance where that had been referred to. You can come up here using, because we're just using a text editor at this point, run a find for, maybe if I look at, for example, my name, I replace it with new name, new email address, anything like that, and then you can deploy that change with Salto.
So, Scott, what I'm hearing is that the edit environment is sort of the newer, better way to do it as opposed to using workspaces.
Yes, that's correct. And Aaron, it should be available in your environment. I'll make sure that we follow up to make sure that you're aware of that feature. And it's actually quite a bit more robust than the older workspace feature. Then if we're going to be around, so please feel free to continue to ask any questions that you might have. And if you have to head out, if you could take a look at our exit, our end poll here. We're just wanting to get an idea about what you found valuable about the session, any feedback that you might have. We'd love open and honest feedback. And after the call, we will likely tomorrow, we will send you out a summary as well as some helpful links, and then a link to the recording. So feel free to share with with anyone on your team. And we will also be sharing a link with how you can learn more, including how to also get started with a free Salto trial. And if you want to get started right now, that QR code has a link to the free trial and our free tier. So we also have a free tier in Salto. You can use it to connect to one environment, and it's good to do all of the impact analysis bit that I shared, where you can see all the dependencies. Now you can't do any sort of deployments, and the backup and restore doesn't work in the free tier, but you can at least get really valuable insight into your environment, like where a field is being used or all of the dependencies of a specific project.
And that can be just as important.
Yes. And again, if you have any questions, please keep them coming. If not, feel free to drop if you could give us some feedback in that poll. And if any other questions, please reach out. That's how you can stay in touch. And we'd love to hear more about how we can help you further safeguard your Jira setup. All right, so if there's no more questions, I'm going to wrap it up in about a minute. So Jimmy, thank you so much for joining. Thank you everyone else for joining. And
Scott, thank you for inviting me to come on here. I really appreciated being here today.
Awesome. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, everyone.